In the middle of the 18th century, a single Anglican preacher named George Whitefield stood in an open field in Pennsylvania, speaking to a crowd of 30,000 people, nearly the entire population of Philadelphia at the time. He did not ask for their denominational credentials, and they did not ask for his. In that moment, the rigid walls of European ecclesiastical tradition began to crumble, replaced by a raw, personal, and distinctly American spiritual energy. This was the birth of a revolution that would eventually redefine the landscape of global Christianity. It is a story not of grand cathedrals or ancient hierarchies, but of the frontier, the tent revival, and the local community. It is the story of non-denominationalism, the great American religious experiment, where the freedom to choose one's faith became as sacred as the faith itself. The history of American Christianity is often told through the lens of institutional giants, the great denominations that carved the continent. Yet beneath and alongside these structured monoliths, a more fluid, adaptive, and increasingly dominant force has been at work: non-denominationalism. Far from being a modern fad, the non-denominational impulse is woven into the very fabric of the American experiment. It represents a fundamental shift in how the individual relates to the divine and how the community organizes its spiritual life, moving away from inherited European hierarchies toward a model of voluntary association and local self-determination. Understanding the ascent of non-denominationalism requires more than a tally of numbers. It demands an investigation into the structural necessities of the frontier, the theological yearning for primitive apostolic purity, and the uniquely American marriage of democratic values with religious practice. This narrative explores the evolution of a movement that began as a functional necessity in the colonies. It transformed into a weapon of conservative protest during the modernist crises, and eventually became the cultural norm for a generation that views denominational labels as vestigial relics of a bygone era. The genesis of non-denominationalism in America was not initially a matter of theological rebellion, but of geographic and logistical reality. When the first European settlers arrived, they brought with them the state church mentalities of the Old World. However, the vast, untamed landscape of the New World acted as a natural solvent for these rigid structures. In the 17th century, the sheer physical scale of the American colonies made the maintenance of centralized denominational authority an impossible task. For Puritan congregations in New England, the distance from England meant that local churches were forced into a state of functional independence. This was not a choice made in a vacuum, it was a structural necessity. Without a proximal bishop or a central synod to adjudicate disputes, the local congregation became the primary unit of religious governance. This Puritan congregational autonomy established a critical precedent. It ingrained the idea that a body of believers possessed the inherent right to determine its own affairs. It gave them the responsibility to elect its own leaders and interpret Scripture without external interference. The practice of self-determination created a blueprint for the independent churches that would later explicitly reject denominational labels altogether. The demographic makeup of the colonies further eroded the possibility of a unified national church. Unlike the homogeneous landscapes of Europe, the American colonies were a patchwork of competing convictions. Because no single group could claim absolute dominance, the concept of a state church became increasingly impractical and eventually politically untenable. In a land where no church was officially the church, every church was, in a sense, a voluntary sect. This pluralism by design fostered a cultural expectation of religious choice. The individual was the final arbiter of their religious affiliation. This voluntary association principle is the bedrock of non-denominationalism. It posits that the church exists because individuals choose to gather. Parallel to these shifts was a powerful theological driver: primitivism. Many early American believers were possessed by a quest for the truly apostolic church. There was a growing suspicion that centuries of church history had served only to obscure the simple ancient order of things found in the New Testament. They sought to bypass the historical developments of the Middle Ages and the Reformation to recapture the purity of the first century church. They argued that the Bible provided a sufficient and complete manual, rendering the party names of Methodism, Presbyterianism, or Lutheranism unnecessary. The challenges of surviving and thriving in a new nation necessitated a degree of cooperation that transcended ecclesial boundaries. This created a paradox, a fierce insistence on local independence paired with a willingness to partner with rival groups for the sake of the mission. This early period provided the essential ingredients: structural independence, individual choice, and biblical sufficiency. These foundations ensured that when the fires of revivalism swept through in the following century, the old institutional dams would be unable to contain the flood. If the colonial era provided the structural skeleton for independent Christianity, the era of the Great Awakenings provided its pulse. During the 18th and 19th centuries, a series of seismic religious upheavals fundamentally altered the American landscape. These revivals demonstrated that spiritual transformation, the new birth, was not a commodity controlled by a specific ecclesiastical brand. The 18th century revivals, led by figures such as Jonathan Edwards and the itinerant George Whitefield, introduced a radical concept: the transdenominational spiritual movement. Whitefield, an Anglican, preached to Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists alike, signaling that the message was more vital than the ecclesiastical vehicle. This era established a precedent where conversion happened through parachurch ministries rather than exclusively within institutional churches. This shift effectively demoted the denomination from being the sole gatekeeper of salvation to being one of many possible venues for it. By the 19th century, this impulse toward independence crystallized into new forms. Gospel tabernacles began to appear, mining a rich vein of American religiosity. These entities proved that large, vibrant congregations could thrive and sustain themselves without any formal affiliation to a distant denominational headquarters. Simultaneously, the Restoration movement gained momentum. Driven by American primitivism, these believers sought to scrap the corrupt traditions of the past. They claimed direct continuity with early Christianity, bypassing centuries of European church history in favor of a simple, Bible-only identity. A fascinating byproduct was the rise of cooperative evangelicalism. Independent-minded groups realized their unity could be manifested through hearty cooperation. This led to the birth of a vast network of interdenominational societies focused on collaborative efforts to print and disseminate Scripture. This included partnerships for the preservation of Sunday observance and the formation of the Sunday School Union and the Evangelical Alliance. This noble rivalry stimulated a surge in Christian activity. It allowed different groups to multiply the agencies for Christianizing the land while maintaining their local autonomy. The Methodist movement also played a pivotal role. They developed intense spiritual disciplines while remaining largely Anglican in their formal doctrine. This demonstrated a group could possess a rigorous internal culture without immediately severing ties. However, the pragmatic success of their methods eventually made independence inevitable. This era effectively deinstitutionalized the American conscience. It taught believers that God could move through a circuit rider or a tent meeting as effectively as through a cathedral. The stage was now set for the next century, where theological disputes would turn this preference for independence into an intentional strategy for survival. As the 20th century dawned, the nature of non-denominationalism shifted from a byproduct of frontier pragmatism to a deliberate tool of theological protest. The fundamentalist modernist controversy of the 1920s acted as a centrifuge, spinning conservative believers out of established denominations toward a new, self-consciously autonomous identity. In this era, being independent was no longer just about local governance. It was a badge of doctrinal purity. The catalysts were often individual pastors at odds with their parent organizations. In 1920s Grand Rapids, Martin DeHaan took the dramatic step of converting Calvary Reformed Church into the Calvary Undenominational Church. This transformation was not merely a name change, it signaled a rejection of compromised denominational identities. The fact that DeHaan's church immediately drew more than 2,000 attendees every Sunday demonstrated the massive scale at which the non-denominational model could operate. A similar trajectory occurred in Chicago, where William McCarroll withdrew his congregation from the Congregational fold to establish the Cicero Bible Church. In 1930, he founded the Independent Fundamental Churches of America, creating a network that provided coordination without rigid oversight. This created a fascinating institutional paradox. The very movement that sought to escape denominations eventually began to develop its own structures to ensure sustainability. While the fundamentalist movement used non-denominationalism to protect orthodoxy, a parallel movement on the theological left used it to pursue a more inclusive vision. In New York City, John D. Rockefeller financed the construction of Riverside Church for Harry Emerson Fosdick, who insisted that the institution remain non-denominational. Riverside proved that the independent model could accommodate liberal theology and high church aesthetics just as effectively as it did the Bible church style. In the Midwest, this impulse manifested in the community church model. Roy Burkhart took over First Community Church in Ohio in 1935, building a 3,400-member congregation by emphasizing lay-led ministry. Burkhart's success was built on a suite of services that prioritized accessibility and local needs. Burkhart was convinced that these community-centered non-denominational churches were the wave of the future, and he actively worked to spread this model through professional associations. By the late 20th century, the trickle of non-denominationalism became a flood. The strategic de-emphasis of denominational labels transitioned from a theological statement into a cultural norm, fundamentally reshaping how American Protestants viewed their religious commitments. The statistical growth during this period was exponential. In 1990, approximately 200,000 Americans classified themselves as non-denominational. By 2009, that number had skyrocketed to over 8 million. This growth was inextricably linked to the rise of the megachurch. In 1970, only 10 evangelical churches in America saw more than 2,000 people on a Sunday. Today, over 700 churches average 3,600 members, with many of the largest identifying as non-denominational. This shift was often strategic. Even churches that remained part of a denomination frequently chose to downplay their heritage in their branding and websites. For many of these congregations, the denominational identity became effectively invisible to the average churchgoer. One significant result of this trend was the homogenization of American evangelicalism. As denominational distinctives were shelved, the look and feel of worship became remarkably consistent. Whether a church had roots in Presbyterian, Baptist, or Pentecostal traditions, historic patterns of theology and liturgy were often downplayed or entirely overlooked. This has led to a profound generational shift. As many as 70% of young evangelical adults report no denominational allegiance. Many young believers view theology as a superficial distraction from practical faith. This reflects a broader cultural tilt toward pragmatism, a preference for what works over what is historically grounded. By the time Willow Creek and similar movements began their ascent in the 1960s and 70s, the American public was already primed for this shift. Non-denominationalism was no longer an outlier. It was the beneficiary of a cultural preference for independent, consumer-friendly religious experiences. The shift toward non-denominationalism moved from a reactive stance to a proactive strategy. The removal of identifiers became a sophisticated marketing decision. Marketing experts and church growth consultants observed that denominational labels often acted as barriers to entry for the unchurched. Consequently, a new nomenclature emerged. Churches began adopting geographic or aspirational names: North Point, Crossroads, The Journey, or Life Church. This strategic camouflage allowed churches to present a fresh, accessible face to their communities, signaling a focus on relationship over religion. This rebranding was not merely cosmetic, it reflected a fundamental change in the how of church expansion. Success was now measured by the ability to connect with the immediate cultural context. For many modern seekers, the lack of a denominational tag suggests a lack of judgment. However, a byproduct has been a thinning of historical and theological memory. When a congregation stops identifying as Lutheran or Reformed, it often stops teaching the specific histories and confessions that define those traditions. This homogenization of evangelicalism means that while churches may be independent in name, they often look remarkably similar in practice across the globe. The voluntary decision of the individual now takes place within a digital landscape where the brand is often a charismatic lead pastor or a specific worship sound. As we look toward the future, non-denominationalism in America has reached a state of maturity that presents a fascinating paradox. The most independent churches are often the most interconnected. While they reject the denomination label, they are increasingly forming networks that function with high levels of efficiency and global reach. Movements like Acts 29, the Association of Related Churches, and the various streams of charismatic Christianity provide a new model for cooperation. These networks offer the benefits of a denomination, accountability, and church planting support without the perceived stale bureaucracy. They allow local pastors to maintain their autonomy while tapping into a massive decentralized support system. The American non-denominational model is now one of the country's most successful religious exports. In the global South, the independent entrepreneurial church model is the fastest growing segment of Christianity. The liberty of action that defined the American frontier is now defining the urban centers of the developing world. The trajectory reveals a profound truth. Individual decision-making as foundation has proven to be the most resilient force in American religious life. By prioritizing personal choice and local adaptability over institutional preservation, non-denominationalism has managed to remain relevant through centuries of social upheaval. Ultimately, the rise of the independent church is the story of the American spirit applied to the divine. It is a story of how a people, freed from the constraints of state-mandated religion, chose to organize themselves around the why of their faith, continually tearing down old structures to build something they believe to be more authentic, more biblical, and more accessible to the next generation. While the labels may vanish, the impulse to gather freely, worship simply, and govern locally remains the enduring hallmark of the American spiritual experiment. The journey through the roots of American non-denominationalism invites a deeper reflection on how our current spiritual landscapes were formed by the grit and necessity of the frontier. To understand where we are going, we must consider the motives that originally drove believers away from the safety of the center and into the wild uncertainty of independence. Does the modern emphasis on local autonomy truly mirror the New Testament ancient order, or has it become a reflection of American individualism? In what ways does the absence of a denominational label change the way a community interacts with the broader global church? How can a church balance the voluntary principle of the individual with the biblical necessity for deep historical roots? Join us next week as we pivot from the independent spirit to the institutional legacy, discussing the rise, influence, and unique evolution of Anglicanism in America. To ensure you don't miss the next chapter, subscribe now to receive deep dive analysis and all upcoming deep dives into the history of the American church.